Today, we have the opportunity to speak with Heather Boorman, the founding director of Boorman Counseling in Western Wisconsin. Heather is the author of the Gifted Kids Workbook and a blogger and a podcaster at the Fringy Bit, where she shares her journey of homeschooling her three kids with twice exceptionality, or 2E. In this conversation, we'll learn more about what 2E means and why Heather has dedicated her life to this work and what it means to her family and perhaps even yours. Well, welcome, Heather. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us at the Brain Possible today. I'd like to start first, if you could tell us a little bit about your journey and what brought you to this work.
Sure. Well, probably like most people in this work, my kids led me to this place. I have three children. They are almost 16, almost 13, and 8. And I work both with neurodivergency in general. So my oldest son is gifted and has some dysgraphia. And when he was 4, he was asking me questions that were already so deep and philosophical that I wasn't quite sure what to do with them. So I went to a conference about giftedness to figure out how to parent this child. And at that point, I already was a therapist and learned so much about the psychosocial aspects of giftedness that it really is part of the neurodivergent community. And I had no idea about that before my oldest was born. Mm-hmm. So I had started learning about giftedness and how that would impact my work as a therapist and my parenting, and I'm a homeschooling mom also. So my homeschooling and educating of my children. And then my daughter came along and completely flipped my world upside down again. She is the one that's nearly 13. And at 6 or 7, we realized that there was something else going on. All of those things that we could kind of write off as just intense developmental pieces. She wasn't outgrowing. So she was having like the big meltdowns and big emotions and things like that. And, at 2, at 4, you can kind of write it off as like, well, she's just an intense kid.
Yeah.
When it was still happening at 6 or 7, we realized there was more going on. And that led us into the journey of understanding autism. She's been diagnosed with autism, with dyspraxia, epilepsy, and there's probably some other things that I'm forgetting right now. And she's also gifted as well, which led me more into the world of twice exceptionality, which is where you have giftedness and all the psychosocial aspects of that, and then additionally some other neurodivergency going on. So it's been a long journey, and I have grown into specializing within the neurodivergent population as a therapist. And so both a long journey in terms of understanding things from the professional side, and really just as a mom walking in the trenches, understanding what it is like to really live with these intense children that grow us, I think, probably more than we grow them.
Yeah.
And then my 8-year-old came along, and of course he's got his stuff too. But by then I was already right. Right. Yeah. So that's how I have landed where I'm at so far.
Got it. So thank you for going into all of that and sharing your story and your children's stories with me.
Yeah.
Besides being an author and a fellow mama warrior, which we'll get to in a bit, you're also a trauma therapist.
I am. Yeah.
What does that entail?
Sure. So I'm a clinical social worker, and I have a practice. And as I have been working with the population that I have, it became pretty evident that a lot of our kids and then adults have experienced various degrees of trauma, because they're growing up in a world that isn't really designed for them. Um, and so, and I say trauma, and that can be the big T traumas that we typically think of, like abuse and sexual assault and those pieces. But even the little T traumas that we don't often identify as being really traumatic, we can experience in a traumatic way. So feeling isolated, being picked on, having a friend discard you, being called names, any of those things are still very traumatic. And particularly when we have children that have intense sensory perception, just living in the world can feel traumatic because loud noises can feel like they're an assault on their sensory system. And that, and so their brain will flip into this fight or flight survival, feeling like they're in danger. So recognizing that, I did some more work and training in the field of trauma. I'm a certified EMDR therapist, which is a form of therapy that looks very different from talk therapy, and actually gets right at the neurology and the neural pathways in our brain to rewrite those traumatic experiences. And I find it really helpful to be working in doing EMDR with this population in particular, because you don't really have to have the words. You don't have to talk it through. You just kind of, in some ways, re-experience it, but in a way that is safe and where you're in the present moment and go through it with healing. So it's pain. So it's pain with a purpose instead of just re-experiencing the trauma. So that's me as a trauma therapist.
Well, so can we pause there for a second, and can you explain what EMDR is? I actually love that you brought that up, because I've had a few traumatic experiences in my life, as well as many other parents listening. Their kids do. And I didn't even think about all these things, like their nervous system. Oh yeah, that's traumatic every day. But a lot of our parents do. And I highly recommend it myself to people when they say, what can someone do if they've had, this serious thing? And that helped me a lot. So can you share about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the point of us as parents experiencing trauma. I mean, we can experience our own trauma just from living life. But I know for me, I have PTSD type symptoms from my daughter's experience with meltdowns, because they can be very aggressive. So there's a certain noise that she can make that immediately puts me in the startle, which is a trauma reaction, because my body is bracing for the aggression or to have to protect my children or whatever it is that I need to do. So we as parents absolutely experience trauma. And I don't want to paint that in a bad way, because I don't think neurodivergency is a bad thing, but there's challenges for sure that impact the entire family. So for us as parents, recognizing that journey is
I think it's important.
A challenge.
I think a challenge for sure to even recognize it, but I think it's really important just to recognize it, just so that I mean, we like to talk a lot about on here about taking care of ourselves, because we cannot keep pouring out if we are empty, or we're constantly in this fight or flight, which we get into often when our child needs us, or is going through something, or having a seizure, or going to the hospital, or getting picked on at school, whatever. So it's like you're constantly in this. And even this happens for all people, even if they don't have a neurodiverse child at home, they can get themselves into that just through life or whatever happens. Right. And they have to acknowledge it and figure out how to get out. So let's hear about EMDR.
Yep. So EMDR stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing, which is why we call it EMDR, because it's way too many words. So let me explain how trauma is stored differently in our brain, because we need to understand that in order to understand why EMDR works. Okay. So when we go through a typical day and nothing traumatic has happened, so nothing that's triggered intense, unpleasant emotions, we sleep at night, hopefully. And when we sleep at night, we go through the REM stage of sleep, which is rapid eye movement. So it's the stage of sleep where our eyes are darting all over the place internally. Yeah. And that's also the phase of sleep where we dream. Okay. So during that phase, our brain takes the events of the day and it decides how it's going to store that memory in our long-term memory. And what it does is if nothing traumatic has happened, it peels off all of the aspects that we don't need. So we don't need the emotions, we don't need the physical sensations, and it stores the events as just as a narrative, as a story. So if I went to the grocery store and picked up peanut butter, it would store that I had been to the store and picked up peanut butter. Those are the things that I need to remember, but I don't need to remember how it felt at the time or any of those things. So I can talk about going to the store the next day and saying, yep, I picked up Jif and it was $1 off or whatever. And it's just a story to me. Mm-hmm. Now, if I was at that store and there was something traumatic that happened, so not to trigger anybody, but let's say the cashier in front of me was held up at gunpoint. Clearly, that would be a traumatic experience. My emotions would be intense. And when my brain went at night to try and sort through and do the processing that it does during the REM stage of sleep, the intensity of the emotions becomes too big that it just kind of halts that process. Huh. And so what happens is those traumatic memories don't get stored in the same way that non-traumatic memories do. The process isn't able to be completed in our brain. So those memories end up being stored with emotional memory attached to it, with physical memory attached to it. So the next time I go to that store, because my brain wasn't able to process through all of the events, I might physically feel the same as I did standing in line while the person was being held up in front of me. Right. Or the terror, the emotions might just pop up. And it's not as though I would even necessarily know that what the emotional memory was associated with. Just the emotions would flood up into my system and my brain would immediately go into the fight or flight. And so that one explains the triggers, right? And why we get hijacked by the emotions. And again, sometimes those physical sensations too. And what EMDR does then is replicates that REM stage of sleep while we're awake to facilitate the processing of those memories so it can peel off the things that are no longer necessary. So part of what we know is the reason that our eyes are going back and forth during REM stage of sleep is that it's accessing both hemispheres of our brain. Oh. And we need our brain to communicate with each other and send information back and forth. And that's how our brain as a whole stores these memories as narratives and learns things and puts it in our long-term memory. So the way that it does that is by crossing the midline of our body. Any of you with people in OT, or if you've experienced OT yourself, you probably are familiar with the midline of our body, that when we cross that plane, and I know people can't see me, I'm drawing a line down my face.
They can. We're on YouTube now too.
Oh, okay. Well, then you can see me. We're drawing a line down the midway through our body. And any sensory information we get on the right side of our body are left processes. Any sensory information on the right side of our body are left side of our body, our right brain processes. So as we give input to both sides of the body, it crosses that midline, and it makes our two hemispheres talk to each other and pass that information back and forth. And that's what it facilitates this processing of experience. So in EMDR, everyone's awake. We're not hypnotizing anybody, but we facilitate putting information on both sides of your body so that the information then passes between the two hemispheres of the brain and allows you to reprocess those traumatic memories that have been stuck. What that looks like is either you hold on to tappers, so they're little vibrating things that you hold on to, and it vibrates alternately, left hand, right hand, left hand, right hand, while you are thinking of or bringing up the emotions, the experiences of something traumatic that has happened, or an unhelpful belief that was formed out of trauma. So EMDR, you can be either holding these tappers, these buzzers, or you can actually kind of like those black cat clocks that, their eyes go back and forth and their tail swings, but their body stays put. We can use either our fingers to go back and forth so that the patients are just moving their eyes and following. And again, it's crossing that midline. Or there can be bars, or we can use sound, anything that stimulates alternate sides of the body. And in that process, your brain then connects to whatever it needs to connect to heal and process through any of those experiences that you've had. It's pretty weird I don't know what your experience was, but it's pretty weird for people to experience, I think, because sometimes your brain takes you to something that feels completely unrelated, but it is related. And so, I've had people that are thinking of a cat, and then they think of the color white, and then they feel sick to their stomach. And by the end of it, a memory that had initially brought them to tears at the beginning of the session, by the end of it, they know it happened, but they don't have the feeling, like they just can talk about it.
Yeah, I do remember that. I do remember that specific experience.
Yeah. I mean, and it isn't always so quick that it's just one time, but it's pretty quick, and studies shown that it's pretty long lasting. So I would say for anyone who's interested in EMDR to look for someone who's certified or been trained through Emdr, which is EMDRIA, the International Association, because there are some other places that do training for EMDR, but they're not quite as thorough. And you want to have a therapist who knows what they're doing, because it is jumping right into some traumatic things. And I've seen people be opened up and not had the resources to kind of pull it back together and heal. So you want to go with somebody who knows what they're doing. But otherwise, it's my go-to for any type of anxiety, any type of difficult experience that somebody has had that still just lingers. Nightmares, it can work really well for nightmares.
So my experience is similar, but a little different. It was a long time ago, though. I don't know if anything's different, but it has changed. Sure. But I had headphones on.
Okay, sure.
Do you ever?
Yep.
Yeah, same thing?
Yeah, same thing. Okay. I'm assuming then there was either music or tones that alternated.
It was a tone.
Yep.
And what my doctor had me do was just repeat the same story.
Okay.
Or maybe multiple stories at different times, sure. Again and again, until it just kind of like went from very intensely traumatic to, sure, like you just said, it kind of just was.
Yeah.
And it was interesting.
Yeah, it's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, it's amazing, and just such a quick change. So I'm guessing that the protocol has changed, and I mean, potentially since when you had EMDR. It's a relatively new therapy. Okay, it was just first developed in the 80s. So
I did it 10 years ago.
Okay.
Well, yeah, almost 10 years ago when my son, 10 years ago when my son passed away.
Yeah.
And it's funny you said the grocery store thing, because I just remembered, and this nothing happened in the grocery store for me, but I couldn't walk into a grocery store without being like, like,
Yeah.
I just was too much for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, things just, it just helps. And thank you for sharing about that, because I didn't really understand what it was. I just did it.
Sure. You just did it and it worked. Yeah.
I know they do it a lot with vets, right?
Yep. There's a lot of, it's one of the most studied types of therapy. Most of the studies are with vets or sexual assault survivors. I've used it with people who experience anxiety but haven't had trauma.
Right.
People who have lingering beliefs that are unhelpful.
Yeah.
Like I'm stupid or I'm not good enough, those things. Because again, it doesn't have to be a big trauma to affect our worldview.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
100%. Well, thank you so much for sharing about that. I hope that that helps someone listening. Can you talk to me a little bit about your kids? What are their So you shared with me about your daughter. Was it your daughter? She has epilepsy and autism, among other things. And she's gifted. What are they like besides those labels?
Sure. Okay, well, I'll start with my oldest. I call him Cub, on which he still lets me do on social media things. So he's almost 16, and as I said, gifted and has some dysgraphia, which means it's difficult for him to connect his thoughts into writing. So he has to actually think about the process of writing, which just slows everything down. And I mean, most of us just can write, and we don't actually have to think about how to form the letter E anymore, right? So he does really well with typing or other things. He is a fantastic actor, if I can say so myself. And being the oldest of 3 differently wired kids, he embraces that role. It's taken some time. There's been, some grieving that our family doesn't look the way that we anticipate family will look. And clearly there's, struggles and joys, but he is so caring and thoughtful. And at this point, to give hope to any families with siblings out there, because for sure my daughter's stuff is the most intense. To give some hope, he went through those times where he was really angry, feeling, pushed to the side, all of those things. We worked through that, and now he will repeatedly say that he is so thankful for his sister, because without her, he would be less compassionate, he would be less tolerant, he would be less mature, he wouldn't understand things, and he just wouldn't be him. And so,
isn't that amazing?
It's so beautiful. Yeah, it really is amazing to see how he has shifted, how he's able to interact with his sister. It's just, they have this beautiful relationship, which I have to hold on to, because the relationship between her and her younger brother, not there yet. So I have to be like, it can transform.
Well, yeah. 16 and 8.
Right. Yeah. Big difference. Yeah. Yes. So that's my oldest. K-Bear is my middle, and she is the only daughter. And is so creative and funny. She has been fascinated by medical things from a very early age. So she would be watching YouTube videos of actual surgery when she was 5, and I'd be grossed out, and I'd be grossed out, and she'd be like, "Mom, look at what they're doing with the heart." And I'm like, "Yep, that's awesome."
Oh my gosh.
And so she'll, for Christmas this year, she got just a kit of all these different building supplies and craft things, and tubing from Home Depot, and loves it because she'll just take those things and she'll create different medical supplies for her babies, her dolls.
Wow.
So she'll, yeah, I mean, it's just she's made like little feeding tubes. She's made
oh my gosh, a ventilator.
She's made a ventilator. Yes, she has. She's made, I mean, cochlear implants. I mean, it's so fascinating to watch. And I'll go up there and there'll be a baby that now the arm is gone, and like she's made some sort of, why can't I think of the word? Prosthetic arm. I mean, it's fascinating and amazing to see her compassion with that too. And we've done a lot of work. She's done a lot of work to get to the place that she's at now. So she has had all of the therapies, and for sure has, still struggles with getting overstimulated, but is able to express that in ways that allow me in a little bit more. So I'm not just having to read her. She was supposed to be starting middle school. She was public schooled throughout. Supposed to be starting middle school. She went to the first 2 weeks this year, and she said, "Mom, the social stuff is just really too hard for me to figure out. I want to come home." And I said, with all the other stuff, fair enough. We'll bring you home so you can relax your anxiety. We can coach you on some of the social things. We can still learn, because you're not going to be able to learn if you're feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So I've been able to learn more from her about just what it feels like to be in her body, how to connect with other kids. She's amazing connecting with other autistic kids. She just gets them. I mean, I swear they communicate in a way that's beyond what neurotypical people are able to understand and do. So, so that's her. She's amazing. She's taught me love in a way that I never knew was possible. But I don't want to dismiss how hard it was to get there.
Yeah.
There's lots of times I was rocking on the floor crying and praying like, I can't do this. I have nothing left in me. So there's, still days, but they're days. It's not weeks and months and years anymore. Yeah. And then I have my 8-year-old, and he has intense anxiety for lots of different reasons. I was kind of hoping he was not going to be gifted, because while a lot of people think it's an amazing gift, which it is, there's a lot of downsides and challenges to it as well. And it's an intense parenting thing, but no, he is also gifted. So, which is great in some ways and also difficult. And he, like I said, has intense anxiety and is 8. So trying to figure life out. He is also extremely creative, loves imaginative play. It started out in this world as just constantly smiling and lighthearted, which was awesome, and makes it painful to see how life circumstances have changed that for him right now. But I know that's who he is. And so we're just in the trenches, getting through, figuring out how to deal with anxiety. He's at the point where he's able to separate his sister from autism, which is nice. So he's able to say that when he's angry, he'll say, "I hate autism." And I'm like, I know it's really hard, but that's so much better than saying, "I hate my sister." He's able to see that she's struggling with things and fighting her way too. So we'll get there, but it's intense. You know, I mean, parenting children with high anxiety is not easy, and hard to be patient and compassionate in the middle of 2-hour panic attacks or whatever. But he'll get there. I'm confident of that. Yeah.
Well, I love your grace.
Yeah.
and your authenticity, that it was like that you have been rock bottom before. So that there's possibility beyond that.
Yes. And, you know, there's grace at this moment. That doesn't mean I'm feeling it all the time. Yeah.
Okay, so twice exceptionality is a cornerstone of your work, which you define as having some type of neurodiversity along with being gifted. How does this show up in your life and the lives of those that you work with?
Sure.
You've touched on that a little bit, but I had not heard this term before, so I want to dive a little deeper into it.
Yeah, it is a new term for many people. It was new for me. Also, so again, giftedness has its own neurodiversities to it. If we think of a bell curve, which I'm not really a fan of standardized tests. I don't think they show a complete picture at all. But for the sake of numbers and comparison, it helps. So if we think of a standard bell curve, anyone who is 2 standard deviations off the norm is considered gifted, with a little bit of fudging in there. So that's the section of the bell curve that's got about 2.5% to 5% of the population that are similarly wired to them. If we go 2 standard deviations off the norm on the other end of the spectrum, we're talking about people with an IQ around 70, which we know kids with an IQ of around 70 just naturally have differing needs. They're considered cognitively delayed, developmentally delayed oftentimes. Socially, emotionally, they just have different needs. And
I like that you said that, different needs.
Just different needs. And we know that. I mean, we just intuitively know that. Gifted kids are just as far off the norm, just on the other side of the spectrum. So they also have different needs, but just often get unrecognized. You know,
totally. Because school is for like the average chunk in the middle, right?
Yes, absolutely. Right. And so, they often get they're smart enough, they'll make it through. Well, this came easy to them. Let's have them tutor other kids, which is the stupidest idea ever, because like they just knew it intuitively. So they don't know how to teach it. They just knew it. Right. And there's other aspects that go along with it that, are the psychosocial differences as well. Essentially, gifted kids experience the world in a more intense way. So their emotions can be more intense, their physical energy can be more intense. That doesn't mean they're more skilled, it just means they have more energy flowing through their system. So they can look like ADHD. Intellectually, imaginationally, they're sensory, they can have more intensity as well. So you take a gifted kid who can be, you see one gifted kid, and they can have any conglomeration of these different intensities. They can be gifted in various ways, right? They could be, mathematically gifted and behind in reading. They could be gifted in the creative arts or in leadership, but not in other areas. So one gifted kid looks completely different than another gifted kid. And then with twice exceptionality, we add in some other type of neurodiversity. So I'll use autism because that's what I know. And with an autistic child, you see one autistic child, right? It doesn't, again, there's so many different variations of what autism can look like also. So their sensory intensity can look different. It can be sensory overload or under receptivity. It can be this type of sensory piece that's hard for them. It can be communication that's hard for them. And then you throw all of that together and you really have like these really unique kids. It's hard to peel apart what is typical, what is something that's a helpful trait for them, what is something that is getting in their way. Oftentimes their other neurodiversity masks the giftedness because for my daughter, for example, she has to, or I'll take my son, that might be easier. With the dysgraphia, it might look like he's not a good writer. Handwriting is difficult for him, but storytelling, he's an amazing storyteller and an amazing writer in that way. Just getting it onto paper is difficult. But if he were in a traditional school setting, they say write a story, and the creative part, the storytelling, might not be able to be seen because he's keeping his sentences short. He's writing with really short words because that's going to be easier for him.
Right.
So it can mask the giftedness. But the flip side also, giftedness can mask the other exceptionality as well, because they're able to make up for it, right? So a lot of times these kids just look like they pass as typical, as the average student.
Or just a little different, but
or just
people don't understand why they're
different. Right. And so to peel off the layers becomes really complicated for parents and providers. Or we might not even recognize that there's layers to peel off of. With my daughter, one of the things that's really difficult, I know that her communication is affected. That's one of the things that you look for with autism, right? But she appeared typical based on all of the developmental markers, a little bit on the later side of normal, but which I said in air quotes for those that are just listening, a little bit on the later side, but still within that typical range. But I could see that she wanted to communicate more than what she could. Like when you know your kid, you just can see it, right? So I kept looking for ways to get speech therapy or other assistance or whatever. I was like, but her potential is far different from what she's able to produce. I can see that. But because all the standardized tests, she appeared within the average range, like you couldn't get services for it. Now, because she's older, the communication piece is stunted enough or delayed enough that she can't match up with her same age peers anymore. But if she could have gotten services at an earlier age, like maybe we wouldn't be at this point, So it's challenging in a whole different way, because you've got all the challenges of the typical neurodiversities, and then they're interacting with all of the challenges of giftedness. And most people don't know about it.
Yeah. So. You're actually, I wasn't sure at first where you're going to go with the bell curve thing, but it really helped me because I'm a visual learner, and I totally got that. It made sense to me now.
Yeah.
Is so you call it 2E?
2E. Yep.
Okay. Is 2E something that traditional medical doctors would recognize and celebrate, or does it take a certain perspective to connect those dots?
Yeah, it takes a certain perspective. That's a big reason why I have moved into the role of advocacy, speaking, writing, because there's so many therapists that don't know it, that don't understand it. I've been working in the field and hadn't been exposed to it until I sought it out because of my personal life. So you see a lot of kids that are misdiagnosed.
I bet.
Medical doctors are going to know even less than mental health providers. Teachers often aren't aware of twice exceptionality. It's just not part of their training.
They're not taught.
So they're not taught.
I blame them if they're not taught, unless people have some reason to go out and learn for themselves because they are interested for some reason.
Right. Yeah. They're not. Exactly. There's no, I mean, so it's more of a systemic issue.
Yeah, because they're taught to work with that middle of the bell curve.
Yeah. Right.
Not to do with what's on either end. When that happens, there's percentages that they're going to have students that come and interact with them.
Yeah.
What do they do then?
Right.
They really should, look at that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, even special education, which actually gets funding, their mainstream teachers aren't really taught very much about special education either. And there's nothing as far as the gifted and talented side of it. I mean, it's just, and as a therapist, there's not really much as far as trauma or psychological, understanding psychology of these children either.
Mm-hmm.
And my God, after this year and a half, we need everyone to understand trauma, right? We've all been traumatized this entire time. So there's certainly some educating that needs to keep happening. Oh my gosh,
yes. Needs to be talked about. There's so many things that need to be talked about, but are not being talked about. So let's just do it ourselves.
Right? Amen.
Can you tell our audience about the Gifted Kids Workbook?
Sure.
What's that about?
Yeah. So that's a book which I was really excited to be approached to write by a mainstream publisher. So that was exciting because up to this point, most gifted books are by those little niche publishers, that are, yep. So New Harbinger had approached me to write a workbook as part of their Instant Help series. And it is written for kids 7 to 12-ish. Age is so variable when you're talking about a neurodivergent community. But it's filled with, I think, 32 activities that are all based on helping gifted children and twice exceptional children understand who they are as unique and valuable people. It's to help them understand that they are different, but that doesn't mean better, worse, or anything else. But one of the things we don't do with kids, is gifted kids in particular, we don't talk to them about their differences.
That's what I was just wondering in my head. I was like, wait a second, you want to tell them they're different?
Yes, yeah, because we don't talk to, yep. I mean, same with any kind of neurodivergency, because here's what happens. Kids are very egocentric. So if they sense, they know that they're different. They already know it. I've had 5-year-olds come into my office and tell me that they're certain that they're aliens because they are so different from everybody else around them. They know they're different from a very early age. And if we don't talk to them about that, then they assume their own meaning to that. Yeah. And they assume there's something wrong with them.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So we want to talk about it to them, obviously in age appropriate ways, but to explain why they experience the world differently than other people around them, why they're having a hard time making friends, why their emotions are so big, why they're in 5th grade and still having crying meltdowns on the playground when other 5th graders might not be. So the workbook, it's written so that you can just give it to a child and they can go through it. And it has, like a short 1-page story or information thing about an aspect of giftedness. And then there's 2 activities that go with each chapter that are hands-on. And again, kids can do it on their own, or some of them they're supposed to do with the adult around them. Mm-hmm. I encourage adults to do it with their kids because I know that they will learn as much as their kids will. And I mean, that's been some of the feedback I've gotten from parents. Okay. They're like, wow, I've learned about myself while doing this. So it goes through, the intensities that I kind of briefly mentioned. It goes through some social skills. It goes through anxiety and depression, which are more common in gifted kids and adults. It goes through dealing with the intensities and how to choose who you want to be, how to accept who you are, and how to recognize the differences with the mainstream population, and then choose how you want to interact and understand, if that makes sense. Because there's some people that won't be able to tolerate their quirkiness, like some other people that won't be able to tolerate their quirkiness. And so then, okay, what do you want to do with that? Do you want to try and maintain a friendship, or does it make sense to not, or to choose how much of your quirkiness you're going to put out there in the world?
Yeah. So is it for all different? So you named a bunch of different scenarios, right? That might go through in the workbook. Is it for, like, you can pick and choose which ones you want to work on, or is it intended, like, I'm thinking, since everyone is so different, maybe
right.
they might have some of this, but they don't have the crying fits on the playground.
Right.
And that might not apply to them.
Right.
So is it still for everyone in the kind of, if you're in a kind of gifted? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, you can, I mean, they're organized in a way that makes sense to go through, but you don't have to go through it in that order. You can pick and choose what fits for you and what doesn't fit for you. And
does it also help kids understand? Sorry, I don't have the workbook, so but I'm just thinking, does it also help them understand maybe if one certain thing might not apply to them, but help them learn, well, yeah, there's other people who have this, and I can understand that, and I can, now, I don't know, I guess just say, I don't want to say, I don't know if it's embrace it, but I can understand that and appreciate it, and now I get it.
Yeah.
Does it help like that?
Yes, absolutely. It's based on mindfulness and self-compassion. And so mindfulness is being aware without judgment. And self-compassion is being aware and kind to ourselves. And when we can do that, it naturally increases compassion towards other people as well. So for sure, the whole book, I mean, my whole approach to everything is about acceptance and compassion and understanding ourselves and other people, that we're all unique. And
I like that.
And if we can understand what's underneath behaviors, it helps us connect on that more human level.
Yeah, I love it. If a parent or caregiver is listening and really resonating with the 2E concept for a child in their life, what advice would you offer them?
Oh,
I know.
Yeah. The first advice and foremost, which you kind of had already touched on, is to make sure that they're getting the support and that they're being self-compassionate, and that they take care of themselves, because it's an intense journey, and then it's lovely and it's not lovely. And it requires so much more of us as parents. And that's what I see the most, as parents coming in and feeling like there must be something wrong with them, because parenting is so much more difficult and everybody else seems to have it all together, which, first of all, nobody has it all together. And second of all, it is more difficult when you have neurodivergent kids. It just is. And that doesn't mean that we don't love our kids. It doesn't mean that there's something bad about it. It's just different and requires much more of us. So making sure that you're filled up and that you're compassionate, because when we do that, that changes the whole energy of the house and allows you to be there for your children in a much different way, in a much more whole way. And it models to them how to treat themselves. And then as part of that, it's surrounding yourself with people who get it. Whether that's in your natural environment with friends or whether family or whether that's providers, but finding people who get it.
Yeah, that's great. That's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
And where can listeners find out more about you and your work?
Mhm.
Do you
Sure.
work with people virtually by any chance, or does it have to be within Wisconsin?
Yeah. Well, for therapy, well, everybody's been doing virtually now, but
I know.
for therapy itself, I'm licensed in Wisconsin and Minnesota. So if you're looking any kind of real therapy, that you need to be located in one of those states. But as far as consults or parent coaching or things like that, that I do internationally, really. So
As an advocate for someone,
yes, yeah.
an advocate
So
can just be like priceless for whatever it is that we're trying to move through.
yes, yeah, and just doing that problem solving with somebody
Yes.
who gets it and can provide more education and help you see your kids' behavior through a different lens maybe than what you could see when you're too close to it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can find me either at thefringybit.com, which is Fringy, bit. That's a blog and a podcast that's going through a shift. It was originally started with my kid's dad, and we're no longer together. So I'm shifting that around, but there's a blog and a podcast that shares my personal experience on there, or through Boorman Counseling, which is my therapy practice. You can connect with me there too, and that's just boormancounseling.com.
Perfect. Heather, is there anything else that you would like to say to the Brain Possible community to be complete?
To be complete. We've done a pretty good job. I think we've covered a lot of things. Really, I want you all to know that you're not in this alone. It can feel very isolating. I know for me, with a child on the spectrum, there's only so much she can tolerate out in public. So we can't always get out. I mean, even before a pandemic, we couldn't always get out. And my experience is so different from a lot of other parents. So even if it feels like you're alone, you're not alone. You've got people in your corner. You've got people that understand. And I know that there's days where it feels like you can't take another step forward. But you'll find the strength. I don't entirely know where it comes from, but we find it, and there is hope. It does look different as you keep moving forward, and your kids learn, and you learn how to interact with them in a different way.
Thank you for that. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today at the Brain Possible community.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation today and that you learned something new. Do you have a question for Heather? Have you ever heard of twice exceptionality before? Do you think your child might fit that mold? We would love to hear from you. Email us at info@thebrainpossible.com. Be sure to subscribe, follow, and share our podcast if that feels true for you. You may also consider visiting our website for more information on stories, therapies, and products that we think that you will love. As always, thank you for spending your precious time with us at The Brain Possible. See you next Thursday. Be well.